I'm Jack Gallant. I'm a neuroscientist here at Berkeley, and I actually got involved in this neuroethics center kind of by accident because some work I did about 10 years ago led to an unintended ethical consequence, which is the best brain decoder that had ever been invented. And it was good enough brain decoder, used MRI, non-portable technology, but it was a good enough brain decoder to scare me and everyone in my lab and most of the people who saw it, because it showed that we kind of have the capacity, even with our current very primitive brain technology, to decode an amazing amount of information from the brain. And that obviously brings up a host of ethical issues. You know, the brain's a pretty complicated organ. It's, of course, the thing that makes us unique and gives us consciousness and makes us humans. If we didn't have a brain, we would just be a filter feeder, like a sponge sitting on the bottom of the ocean doing nothing much interesting at all. So we all have very proprietary feelings about our brain. In fact, usually when we think of ourselves, we think of essentially our brain as the organ. If I think of my hand, it's my hand. It's not me, the hand, right? But my brain is kind of me. So our brains are obviously the most important organ we have from a narcissistic brain point of view, right? The brain, of course, thinks it's the most important organ. But it's very, very complicated. There's, 80 billion neurons. Most of those are in the cerebellum. We still don't know exactly what the cerebellum does. A lot of them are in the cerebral cortex. They're organized in these very, very complicated networks. It's a truly magnificently complicated and difficult organ to understand. And we have very sort of poor technological tools currently to measure it and to manipulate it. So we can apply neuromodulatory drugs to the brain. Those usually only affect very broad brain systems. They have very broad effects and a lot of unintended side effects that are generally unpleasant. We have some limited ability to put electrodes in the human brain to do neuromodulation, either through deep brain stimulation or through electrocorticography, where we record the brain signals. But the amount of modulation that we can do and the amount of brain signals we can read currently is very, very limited. Just to take an example, if you have a deep brain stimulator implanted, say, to address Parkinson's, that stimulator is programmed once in the doctor's office, and it's just left in that state for essentially 6 months straight. It never changes. It doesn't adapt depending on your circumstances or what you're trying to do. It's just sort of a fixed device. So this is one of the most advanced brain technologies we have, and it's incredibly primitive, and sort of, if you just think about how the thing works, it's silly, right? It's better than nothing, but it's not where we want to go. The brain is difficult to measure non-invasively. So the most advanced method we have for measuring the brain non-invasively is functional MRI, and a standard clinical fMRI machine costs $6 million. The new Frankenstein MRI machine that we're building here at Berkeley through an effort between Berkeley and the federal government is a $20 million science project. It's very, very expensive. Obviously, people aren't going to wander around with this technology on their heads anytime soon. We have portable technologies like EEG that you can just buy in the toy store and stick on your head now, and they're almost useless. They have very low bandwidth, very low signal to noise. So our technologies for non-invasive brain measurement and modulation are also very poor. But all of these things are going to change. All of these things are going to develop in the future because brain disorders in the United States are an enormous problem on a variety of fronts. Depending on how you look at the numbers, something on the order of, say, 80 million people in the United States have some sort of brain disorder that could potentially be ameliorated by an appropriate drug or a technological brain intervention device. These disorders include mental disorders such as schizophrenia or autism spectrum disorder or dyslexia or obsessive compulsive disorder or depression, right? The whole panoply of mental disorders that we have. These include disorders that affect the motor system, like paralysis, and disorders that affect the perceptual system, like blindness and deafness, right? So there's a huge market for essentially neurotechnologies that can ameliorate these various brain disorders. And the federal government has an enormous interest in investing in this area, and private companies, of course, would have an enormous interest in developing these technologies also. And so there's a lot of money that goes into neuroscience. But because the brain is complicated, these investments are slow to pay off. And so the time scale for the ethical issues involving neuroscience, I think, is slower than the time scale for the ethical issues involving AI and genomics, because those are problems we have today, and neuroscience is kind of a problem we're going to have tomorrow. So in the future, somewhere, we don't know when, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, certainly within 100 years, we're going to have a variety of neurotechnologies that are going to completely eclipse what we have today. These are going to be targeted drugs that affect very specific brain subsystems or very specific classes of receptors in local regions of the brain. Large scale, very high capacity, closed loop invasive brain stimulation devices. Some of you are probably familiar with Elon Musk's company Neuralink, that is developing a very cool technology that will be able to put in hundreds or thousands of extremely thin microwires into the brain. These should be relatively biocompatible, certainly compared to what we have today. And these will dramatically increase the bandwidth for both writing into the brain and for reading information from the brain. There are going to be invasive brain stimulation devices that aren't just set it and forget it, but which are actually closed loop systems that measure the environment around a patient, and that also measure the brain state and then adapt the brain stimulation in closed loop form based on current circumstances, basically based on what the environment is and what the patient needs to optimize their behavior. And those are already currently in sort of early scientific trials. I'm involved in one of those teams, and those will be coming down the pike in 20 or 30 years. There are going to be portable devices for non-invasive brain reading. Nobody knows when this is going to happen because nobody knows what technology would support this. But one of the great things about science is things happen that nobody expected, and it's just a matter of time before we can read brains non-invasively. And you can just wear a little thinking hat. You go to Japan, you don't speak Japanese, you think in English, and it speaks Japanese out your hat, right? It would be a great device, and it's just a matter of time before that happens. So these technologies bring up sort of 4 general areas of ethical concern in neuroscience that I've listed here. And these kind of obvious when you think about it, but each of them is a big topic, and each of them overlaps with some aspect of the other neuroethics issues we're going to be dealing with in the center, involving either genomics or AI. The first is obviously, the first may not be obvious. It's agency and identity. Even today, there are issues with agency and identity involving deep brain stimulation. People who have deep brain stimulators implanted sometimes suffer from changes in their behavior that they feel they have no control over, that can have dramatic effects on themselves and their family life. For example, they can become obsessive gamblers, or they can become unconcerned with certain aspects of their life that they used to be concerned with. And this not only changes their behavior, but it changes their perception of themselves, because they essentially feel that they have an urge, or they're being compelled to do something that it sort of violates their normal perception of themselves. So these devices can have an enormous effect on agency and identity. The second is kind of the most obvious issue, and it's the one that I deal with the most. It has to do with privacy. Everything that you consciously can think about in your brain, everything that's in conscious awareness right now, is potentially decodable. Because if you are conscious of something, that means that there's information percolating around in active brain circuits, and anything that's in active brain circuits is potentially decodable, even things that you're not aware of. So for example, it's 10 minutes to 10. Some of you probably somewhere deep down in the bowels of your brain are thinking about lunch, like, oh, I'd like a burrito for lunch. Maybe that's not a conscious thought yet, but if we had a brain decoding device, if that's even a sort of a unconscious thought that's percolating around in active brain circuits, that is potentially decodable. In fact, the only information that we can't decode from the brain is currently stuff that's locked away in long-term memory. So for example, if I ask you to think about the name of your first grade teacher, you can probably do that. Okay, I can do that, and that's pretty good for me because I have a poor memory. But you probably haven't thought about that for a long time. So before I asked you to think about your first grade teacher, it was locked away in long-term memory circuits in some form that neuroscientists still don't understand. But the second you sort of emerge that thought into active working memory, now it's potentially decodable. So a large range of things are potentially decodable. We don't have any good systems for giving informed consent for these sorts of devices. We don't have any good systems for controlling access to the information if somebody controls a device or builds a device. We don't have any good regulatory scheme for governing how or who or when will have access to that information. And in fact, under current evidentiary law in the United States, your thoughts are considered to be of the same sort of evidence as, say, your blood or your hair or your fingernails. In other words, the government can compel you to give them up. So if we had a brain decoding device today, the government could put it on your head and force you to think about the crime and decode all that information. You would have absolutely no privacy rights over that information. The third issue is bias. Obviously, bias is an inherent part of the human condition, and it enters all human decisions, and including all efforts to develop science and technologies. And these bias, of course, emerges in a lot of different ways. The Ethics Center is very concerned with bias. I know the AI community recently this has been a big issue having to do with bias in AI algorithms. And we also need to think about this in terms of the development of neurotechnologies. We need to think about what human participants are being selected for both basic science trials and what human groups are going to be used to develop these technologies and to verify them and show that they work. These biases also are going to obviously enter into in economic decisions having to do with who gets access to neurotechnologies and how they're distributed, which brings us to the last issue, enhancement. Just as Stuart mentioned, for the future of genetics is probably going to lead to a lot of pressure to apply a genetic manipulation to human enhancement. And of course, that will also happen for neuroscience. The minute there are neurotechnologies that can increase your memory or your reasoning ability or your general intelligence, there will be a large clamor to have these technologies and to adopt them for individual people. And there's going to be big issues about fairness of access to those technologies and how they can be deployed widely, and how we can minimize bias in both the application of those technologies and bias against people who may not want those technologies. There are also weird side cases you may not have thought of, for example, having to do with corporate governance. So I don't know how many of you pay attention to the neuroscience news, but there has been a long-standing effort to develop brain implants for the blind that are essentially electrodes that are implanted in the visual cortex. And there are a handful of patients with these devices, and the company that manufactured these devices has just gone out of business. And so now there are people with brain implants, and they can't get their batteries replaced. And if the processor breaks, they have no ability to replace the processor, and they have these brain implants in their head, and they're not sure who's going to take care of them. And it's obviously a big ethical dilemma involving corporate responsibility. So it's not as if nobody has thought about this issue. There are a lot of groups that are involved in ethics. The Neuroethics Society is the big one, but the Society for Neuroscience, which is the largest neuroscience group in the world, the meeting has 30,000 attendees every year. They have an ethics group. The IEEE, which is the largest engineering society in the world, has a brain community that has a very strong ethics component in it. And actually, I'm head of the IEEE brain community this year, and that's the meeting I have to run at 10. So we're very, very interested in neuroethics. The National Academy of Sciences has had a program for the last several years on neuroethics and the law, because judges are becoming increasingly faced with neuroscience evidence, and they need to decide whether they should admit that evidence in court. So there are big ethical issues about transferring neuroscience knowledge into the legal system that have to be addressed. The European Union has been thinking about updating their privacy rules. The European Union has very good privacy rules, but they are constantly under update because every time the EU promotes a privacy rule, people find a way to get around it. So they're constantly revising the rules. And one of the things they're considering is revising the rules to focus on brain privacy, to encompass brain privacy as well as everything else. And finally, weirdly, in a really interesting move, the government of Chile last year proposed a constitutional amendment, which is going to be a neuro rights amendment to the Constitution. That hasn't been voted on yet, but it's in process in Chile, and that was an effort promoted by Rafa Yusta, who's a very well-known neuroscientist from the university. So there are a lot of groups involved in this. And we also do ethics education for neuroscientists and engineers. All young neuroscientists have to take sort of an ethics module or a short ethics course in order to maintain their graduate status. This is required by the NIH. All engineers take a series of ethics courses, and so both of these groups are trained in ethics. But I guess from my perspective, the current ethics training for neuroscientists and neuroengineers is focused on kind of current ethical issues. For example, don't fabricate your data, don't mistreat your subjects, be very, very concerned about animal welfare, things like that. Those are all very, very important issues, but they don't address the future ethical issues we're going to have in neurotechnology. And there's currently no preparation for the people who will be developing these technologies, which is the young graduate students and postdocs. They're going to be the leaders in, out there in 20 or 30 or 40 years doing the neuroscience and developing the technologies that are going to change the way we do neuroscience and the way we apply neuroscience to the brain. And they need to be educated in such a way that they can think not only about the current ethical issues, but about future ethical issues, including ones that we haven't even thought of yet. So I'm very, very excited about that specific part of our Kavli Center, because I think it's going to have the largest long-term impact on how neurotechnology is actually developed and applied in the world. That's it. Thanks for your time.